Moving on now to Sudan, where the UN says a mass grave containing at least 87 bodies has been discovered in the West Darfur region. The victims were reportedly members of an ethnic minority group. The UN's Human Rights Office condemned the killings and said it had credible information that the Rapid Support Forces were responsible. The RSF paramilitary group is fighting the army for control of Sudan. And Egypt is hosting the leaders of Sudan's neighbours to discuss ways to end that conflict. But the warring Sudanese factions have not been invited. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is hosting the leaders of Ethiopia, South Sudan, Chad, Eritrea, Libya and the Central African Republic. They're trying to come up with ways to bring peace to Sudan. The fighting, which began in mid-April, has displaced more than 2.4 million people and more than 700,000 have crossed into neighbouring countries. Meanwhile, the head of the United Nations mission to Sudan says the government has lost control of the country and the confidence in the region. Speaking to Al Jazeera, Volker Perthes reiterated the UN support for any initiative to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict.
The current government lost control of the situation in the country. They lost the trust of the neighbouring countries. In the final communiqué of IGAD, there was no mention of the government versus the Rapid Support Forces, but they only talked about the army and the Rapid Support Forces. They said that they are sorry that the army didn't attend the meeting. From this perspective, this decision clearly shows that this is not about sending armed peacekeeping troops, but more of assessing the situation while keeping in mind the possibility of having to intervene for humanitarian reasons.
And joining me in the studio is Alan Boswell. He's the Horn of Africa Director at the International Crisis Group. Alan, thanks so much for joining me on the program. How hopeful can we be that this meeting in Egypt will make any difference to the conflict? As we just reported, it's been happening since mid-April.
Yeah, not very hopeful, unfortunately. The only people who've been able to bring the two warring parties themselves together thus far have been the United States and Saudi Arabia. But those talks have basically been suspended now for weeks. We've had a flurry of diplomatic activity as different regional states and different external powers are trying to grab the mediation mantle. But unfortunately, we've seen very little progress in actually creating a ceasefire and far too much competition among all these different external powers about who can take the lead on it. But none of these tracks have really any traction yet.
What impact is this conflict having on the region more broadly, and particularly those bordering countries where we've seen such an influx of people fleeing this conflict?
It's having a huge impact. Sudan sits, really at a crossroads between the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. A lot of the neighbours, are very unstable themselves. They've faced a huge influx of refugees, but they also face a whole array of security issues. And there's a lot of cross-border links as well. I think one of the underappreciated parts of this conflict has just been the massive sort of sucking hole that a Sudan collapse will have in the broader region. It will have huge ramifications for probably decades.
We've learnt today of the discovery of a mass grave in the West Darfur region. I mean, that surely has an impact on how these peace negotiations or discussions will unfold.
Yeah, it's sadly not too much of a surprise that this mass grave has been found. The reports of essentially mass atrocities of the sorts that we saw in Darfur 20 years ago, those have been coming out pretty steadily now for weeks, as you know, from the border. But it is raising the question among diplomats, can you negotiate really a peace deal with the Rapid Support Forces who are implicated in some of these atrocities, or are they basically now too damaged, too bad in a way to negotiate with? But the problem is no one has a better idea of how to try to get peace because the RSF in many ways has gained the upper hand in the battle for Khartoum. And
can you explain to us this ethnic violence, the ethnic violence that's really seems to be taking a hold in this conflict?
Yeah, so Darfur in many ways has its own conflict dynamics. The west of Sudan, we were concerned as crisis group when this conflict broke out that one of the major concerns was Sudan has had conflict for many decades. And we'd see some of these old conflicts, some of which had subsided, but we'd see them re-erupting. And essentially that's what we're seeing now in Sudan. It's not just fighting between the RSF and the army like we've seen in Khartoum. It involves fighting between essentially Arab-identifying communities and non-Arab communities. Some of these tensions go back 2 decades. Yeah, and we're really seeing the worst. Some of the reports sound very much like ethnic cleansing.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you explaining a complex issue so succinctly. Alan Boswell from the Horn of Africa, Director at the International Crisis Group. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Emily.